It was Alexander Pope who wrote these words. As the twig is bent, the tree's inclined. Now, all of us understand the truth of that principle. If you want a tree to grow straight and tall, then when it's planted, it has to be straight. As the twig is bent, the tree's inclined. It was the wise man Solomon who, in the Old Testament, said, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Modern day psychology tells us that what we are as adults is largely determined by all of the influences upon our lives from birth until adulthood. Now, whether it comes from the poet or from the Old Testament wise man or from present day psychology, I think that all of us will agree that the training of children is one of the most important things that takes place in our world today. A few weeks ago, we began a series of messages on building relationships. And after presenting the first message on that theme, we have talked about men, husbands, fathers. We've talked about women, wives, and mothers. And today, we're going to focus upon the training of children. We're calling this message, Train Up a Child. And I want to tell you in the beginning that none of us who are parents think that we are experts in the task that has been given us. Most of us want to do a good job. Many have done a good job. And it's sad to say that some have surrendered. And today we want to focus upon some of the things that God has to say about this important matter. And I want to say in the beginning that there was a young preacher who, before he was married and had children, had a sermon which he called 10 Rules for Raising Kids. Then he got married and had some children of his own, and he changed the title of the sermon to 10 Suggestions for Raising Children. And when his children came to be teenagers, he threw the sermon away. Now, that's sort of the way I feel about it, but God does speak to the issue, and we want to share what he has to say. Children are a heritage from the Lord. Psalm 127 tells us that. And we as parents are stewards of those gifts that God has given us. And when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said, it is required of a steward that a man be found faithful. Some of us as parents have children who are grown. Others have children who are teens, who are elementary age or preschoolers. Some may not yet have children of their own, but one day many of you will have. Wherever we find ourselves today in that spectrum, I hope we will give careful attention, not to what I say particularly, but to what God says. Because all of us can have an impact upon young people, whether we have children of our own or whether our children are of any age. We all can be mentors. And we will never contribute to anything greater than a child becoming an adult who is not only useful in his community, but who is faithful in the service of God. So with that, let's come today, first of all, to our text in the 6th chapter of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And I want to place these words before us as we read the text. This is from an unknown author, and it says this: I took a piece of plastic clay and idly fashioned it one day, and as my fingers pressed it still, it bent and yielded to my will. I came again when days had passed. The lump of clay was hard at last. The form I gave it still it bore, but I could change it nevermore. I took a child, God's loving clay, and gently shaped it day by day, and molded with my Savior's art a young child's soft and yielding heart. I came again when years were gone. He was a man I looked upon. He still that early image bore, but I could change him nevermore. The text is Ephesians chapter 6. And this text speaks to children and to parents. Notice what the text says. It begins with children. It speaks to children. And it says, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. Now let's notice a few things here. The first is, you'll note that the English Bible says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It is right for a child to obey its parents. That means to be in subjection to the parent. You see, the parent has the experience of however many years the parent has lived. And usually with experience, there comes some wisdom. Now, it's not guaranteed, but usually that's the case. Parents have more experience and greater wisdom than kids do. And kids would do well to listen to what their parents have to say. They can weigh whether or not that really has bearing upon their lives, but they ought to listen. But notice he said, obey your parents in the Lord. And sometimes it's helpful to know what something means by noting what it doesn't mean. And this does not mean that children are only obligated to obey their parents if their parents are in the Lord, therefore Christians. As a matter of fact, the Expositor's Greek Testament attaches in the Lord to the children. And it would read, children in the Lord, obey your parents, for this is right. And if Expositors is correct, and I think that they are, then this is the first thing that God says to a young person who has become a Christian. Obey your parents. Be in subjection to them because you're in the Lord. And the second thing he says is honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise. That takes us back to the Old Testament. Probably every one of us is aware of the fact that one of the 10 commandments was honor your father and your mother. And not only was that in the list of the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20, but it is repeated in the Old Testament scriptures. The Old Testament word for honor is quite simply respect. And in the New Testament, this word obey and then to honor means to hear under. To hear under is the literal meaning of the word. It is a suggestion that you are under your parents, you'll do well to hear them. It is respect. It is to recognize the worth of having parents. I don't know about you, but I'm concerned about some of the ways that I hear kids talk to their parents. And the father in the family is supposed to be the leader. And we're going to notice in a moment that sometimes the father's absent for various reasons and somebody else must fill that role. But that's the role that God gave to dads. And as fathers, we should never permit our children to speak with disrespect to their mothers, ever. But I see that, don't you? And some of you probably do it, and you need to stop it. Because as a Christian young person, the right thing for you to do is to obey and honor your parents. Now, a child will obey its parent perhaps for several reasons, one of which might be fear for not obeying them. Maybe they're afraid of the consequences. So I can say that you might obey your parent because you're afraid not to, but you can't honor your parents without wanting to obey them. There is respect and submission. Now, Paul takes this back to its original in the Old Testament. He says it's the first commandment with a promise. If you look that up in the Old Testament, when God gave the command to ancient Israel, it was to assure that they would live long in the land that he was giving them. Here Paul says that it may be well with you. Young people who listen to their parents live a happier and more fulfilled life than those who don't. But when the text in the New Testament says that your days may be long on the earth, that is a general truth. That is, it's like a proverb. It isn't a guarantee that if you obey your parents and seek to honor them, that you're going to live to be an old person. But it does say that the quality of your life is going to be improved. Children, obey and honor. Then this text speaks to fathers. It's interesting that the word that's translated fathers here is translated parents in Hebrews 11 when it speaks of the faith of Moses' parents. And I would just say this: the job of training children belongs to mom and dad. Dad is to take the lead in it. And some of us are not doing a very good job in taking the leadership role. You see, if dad always has to be begged to come to church, if he's the last one up on Sunday morning, the last one in the car, and when anything comes up that he'd rather do, he does it, he's sending a message to his kids. And one of those messages is this: religion is for women and children, and when you get older, you won't have to participate either as a son. There can be no greater influence in the life of a boy than his dad. Someone made the observation that the only thing that God can use to make a man is to use a boy. And God has given to us dads the responsibility of helping our boys become men. And that responsibility cannot be passed to somebody else. So here, Paul is really talking to parents, and we have in mind boys and girls, sons and daughters. But he said in you fathers, provoke not your children to anger. Now, if we read that to say that you mustn't ever make your kids mad, we're going to fail as parents. My parents made me mad a lot of times. I don't know about you. And there were times when I thought that only a person without good judgment, really what I thought, it's stupid to think that way. And then one day I read the words of Mark Twain. He said that for the first 18 years of his life, he thought his parents were stupid. That only people without good judgment could say some of the things they said and do some of the things they did. But he went away from home at age 18. He was gone for 3 years, and when he came home, he said it was remarkable how much my old man learned in 3 years. A lot of us have experienced something like that, haven't we? You know what I wish? I wish for one more day of yesteryear when I could sit down with my dad and draw from his wisdom. And you can do that now as a young person. If you're still at home and your dad is there, weigh heavily what is said and done. But here, Paul is saying, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Now, what does that mean? Well, there are several ways that we can exasperate our kids to anger. And I have 6 words today, and I'm just going to touch on them briefly. You might be able to add other words. My first word is overprotection. It exasperates children because, you see, as children get older, we have trained them and we have sought to mold them like the person with the clay that I brought to your attention in the beginning. But there comes a time when we have to trust them. And there comes a time when we have to let them go. Do not overprotect your kids. My second word is favoritism. You would do well if you won't compare your children to each other. Oh, I wish that you could be more like your brother. That's like telling your husband you wish he was more like his dad. Or worse yet, more like your dad. The idea here is this, that children are not the same. They don't have the same abilities. They don't have the same aspirations. And by showing favoritism to one child over another may do great harm and damage. This was a problem in the family of Jacob in the Bible in the Old Testament. Jacob favored Joseph over his other sons, and that led to all kinds of trouble for the whole family and a lot of heartache. I want to tell you a story about 2 boys. The firstborn son was fine in every way. He was smart and he was athletic and he excelled in nearly anything that he tried. He was really his mother's boy. And then a brother was born. He wasn't as smart, didn't do as well in school. He wasn't athletic. He had some health issues and was not able to participate in sports like his older brother. And he lived his early life in the shadow of his brother, having pointed out to him again and again what his brother had accomplished and what he hadn't. And as soon as he got old enough, he ran away from home. And he never came back. And it goes back initially, I think, to the favoritism that was shown to his brother. Be careful when you show favoritism. Number 3, parents can provoke their children to wrath or anger by putting too much pressure on them. You know, there are a lot of parents, I really believe, I see this. There are a lot of parents who would like to live out their own unfulfilled dreams in the lives of their kids. And so they put pressure on them to excel in everything. And maybe they're not really capable of excelling in everything. Watch the pressure you put on your kids. I certainly would not have been able to put a lot of pressure on my kids to make straight A's in school because I didn't make straight A's in school. So why am I putting pressure on them to do what I didn't do? By the way, what is summa cum laude? My 4th word is discouragement. We can discourage a child by finding what's wrong and without finding what is right. And I think it's good advice, and it certainly didn't come from me, but I think it's good advice that when we need to correct our kids, when we find something wrong, we ought to balance that by finding something right. That's discouragement. My 5th word is neglect. How many dads are busy making a living? And that's an important thing. And you want to make a living. You want to support your families. And you want them to live at a standard that you're pleased with and that they're pleased with. But don't do that by making your kids pay for it because you're not there. One of the greatest problems that we have in the American family today is the fathers being absent. Now, some are absent because they have died. Some are absent because they live apart from their family for whatever reason. Some are absent being present, but they're absent emotionally because they're caught up in things that are less important than being fathers to their kids. It's important that we be present. And I would not recommend that you decide, well, I haven't been doing very well with my presence, and so I'm going to have a family night. If that works for you, that's great. That didn't ever work for us because things kept interrupting the family night. You know, I learned something that worked for us, and that is that my kids didn't need a family night. That became an appointment with Dad, and everybody dreaded it. But what they needed was 5 minutes when I didn't have it. And people talk about quality time. Let me tell you, quality time is any minute you spend with your kids. That's quality time. Don't neglect your kids. And my 6th word is abuse. Kids are abused physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And if we give our kids everything and we do not give them guidance toward God, we are abusing them spiritually. Do not provoke your children to anger. But then the text says, but bring them up, and that is bring them all the way up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Now, some translations use different words than those, but the original words still mean the same. To bring a child up in the nurture of the Lord is what the parent does to him. The direction that the parent gives that child is what the child receives. The admonition of the Lord is what the parent says. And what we teach and what we say needs to be in harmony with who we are. Bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Now, with that, let's emphasize a third point that I believe this is my second major point, isn't it? Let's see, A, 1, 2, 3, A. Let's go to point number B. What is the goal of all this? The training of a child. What is it that is to be accomplished? And I want to answer that as simply as I can, and this is what I believe. I believe the purpose of training a child is twofold. And that twofold purpose is the respect for authority and self-discipline. Because it is in the home that a child is going to learn respect for authority. And if he doesn't have any respect for the authority of mom and dad, he will not have any respect for the teacher. He will have no respect for the law enforcement agent. He will have no respect for his boss, and he will have no respect for God. He must begin that respect with his parents. That's why. And that child is a person of dignity and worth. And when a parent will try to guide the child in the right way, the way he should act in his life, he will learn from the parent self-discipline. And that will bring about great blessing in the future. Now, third, what is the content of this training? What is it that we're supposed to teach? Well, there are a number of things, and I'll just list a few of them, and I'll do it quickly. But the first is we need to teach them faith. Because you see, a child's faith begins with parents, normally. And I know there comes a time when that faith has to be examined and weighed and accepted personally. But it begins with a parent instilling faith in the child. Teach him faith. 2, teach him modesty. Modesty in the way they act, and the modesty in the way they dress. Modesty in the way they conduct their lives. Teach them faith and teach them modesty. 3rd, teach them how to work. I've been on the board of trustees at Freed-Hardeman University for 20 years. We get all kinds of feedback from our graduates. Freed-Hardeman University is located in West Tennessee, about 80 miles from Memphis, 120 miles from Nashville. All over West Tennessee, in those major cities and in other cities in West Tennessee, we get word over and over again from employers that we cannot hire enough Freed-Hardeman graduates. Well, we're interested in knowing why. And here's the number one reason. They're willing to work. How many employers have you heard say, I can't get people hired who want to work? Or they want the vacation, they want the times off, they want the salary, but they don't want to work. Teach your children to work, because in the real world, they're going to have to work. And even young children can be given jobs around the house of keeping their rooms or taking out the trash or whatever, but it's teaching them something important, and that is how to work. Next, teach them self-esteem. There's something special about every child. It isn't that we want them to think more highly of themselves than they ought to think. It isn't that we want them to be prudes. It isn't we want them to be stuck up, but they are people of value. And I would be very careful in using such phraseology as, you can't do anything right. Teach them self-esteem. And teach them that failure is not fatal. Whenever one tries, sometimes they're going to fail. Someone said, it's better to try and fail at last than to say the need for trying is past. Sometimes they're going to fail. I have a friend who has a plaque sitting on his desk. If you went in his office, you would see it first every time. Here's what it says. Babe Ruth struck out 1,333 times. Now, most of us, I'm sure, know the name of Babe Ruth, and we know that he held the home run record for many years, and he set his record when many less games were played than in the current baseball season. He hit 714 home runs. That's what we remember about him. He struck out nearly 2 times for each home run that he hit. And my friend's plaque says, Babe Ruth struck out 1,333 times. Keep on swinging. Now I've got one last thing. How's this going to happen? And here again, I'm going to touch on a number of matters and I'll close. How are we going to be successful in the training of children? First of all, it takes time. It takes time to make a woman of a girl and a man of a boy. And we've got to invest the time. Second, it takes example. A careful man I ought to be. A little fellow watches me. Whatever he sees me do, he tries. One day, like me, he's going to be. There is an essential element in the training of a child. If you want your child to be a faithful Christian, be a faithful Christian. Is that going to happen 100% of the time? No. But it's going to happen more than it doesn't. It doesn't do much good for a parent to tell how important the church is unless he's giving his best to the church. And we know whether we're doing that or not. My dad used to tell me ever so often, usually after I'd misbehaved and was trying to explain my way out of some trouble. He said, your actions speak so loud I can't hear a word you say. As parents, we need to take that to heart. In the training of a child, there is example. Then there's discipline. Did you know all teaching is discipline? There are 2 kinds of teaching, or 2 kinds of discipline, rather. One is preventive discipline. That's in teaching children so they won't make the same mistakes we have made. But the other is corrective. Every child needs some rules to live by. The kid at school in junior high kind of stuck out his chest and said to his buddies, "Nobody tells me what to do. I go when I want to go. I come when I want to come. I do what I want to do." All that kid was saying to his friends was, "Nobody cares about me." Kids need direction. And that's one of the reasons that God gave them parents. There need to be rules, and when those rules are violated, then there need to be consequences. I don't know what the consequences you choose to use in disciplining your children might be, but just say, for example, you're going to have time out. A child is misbehaving, so it's time out. He has to sit quietly for so long. And from the very start of it, he's whining and begging, disputing, and finally you just get him in and say, "Okay, go about your business." That's not fair to the child. We need to say, this is what the rule is, and when you violate it, then mom and dad are in agreement that this is going to be the consequence, and that helps shape character. And that's involved in the training of a child. Then there is encouragement. Tell them when they do right, as well as when they do wrong. And the last is consistency. There are a lot of kids, I'm sure, that they don't know really what to do or what to expect because it isn't the same reaction to the same thing. We need to be consistent. What I'm trying to do here today is simply to encourage us to think about it. And if we want to raise a generation of New Testament Christians, then let's be that ourselves, and let's live like what we say we believe, and let's be true and genuine, and let's go to heaven. Let's stand and sing.